Alive Church family. Welcome to part one of our new series, Peacemakers. And I just wanted to say, as you're sitting there right now, you can take notes on your phone by using the Alive Church app. And I really encourage you for this series to take notes because this series ends up being a lot more teaching than preaching, meaning there's a lot of valuable content, at least I hope so, that you're going to want to jot down, to remember, and reflect on during the week. So without further ado, let's jump in. So if I'm being honest, I can hardly remember back when I was a kid and this was happening, but I can very easily imagine what it was like for me as a blonde hair, bowl cut with these big gold, almost Coke bottle kind of glasses. In fact, sipping on a Coke probably to help wash down the Pizza Hut that we were having on a Friday night as the Brookers were having a family movie night. And we were grabbing that VHS, putting it in, and about to watch a movie that, just for the record, was released years before I was born, okay? So I'm not that old, but a movie that even as a young boy was a classic that needed to be watched by every young boy, and that is The Empire Strikes Back. Yes, part of the Star Wars saga, The Empire Strikes Back, with all the different parts that it had to it that were really memorable. For instance, like the "You have failed me for the last time, Admiral." And then he goes ahead and gives the social distance chokehold, you know, that scene. And then there's the scene where Han Solo is about to get frozen, and not frozen, anyway, he's about to get frozen and your emotions are being tugged on. But there's nothing that compares in the whole Star Wars saga to the moment where, again, I don't know if you can remember what it was like when you first saw it, but that moment where Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, the masked menace, are in this heated battle with their lightsabers. They're fighting back and forth, and suddenly, when it's getting really intense, there's this revelation that Darth Vader gives to Luke Skywalker where he says, "I am your father." And I can just imagine as a kid with my eyes probably widened behind those monstrously huge glasses that I was forced to wear, and I was shocked. And I mean, Luke was shocked too, even though he's a fictional character. Luke was shocked because suddenly in that moment, the rules of the conflict seemed to change because the roles in the conflict changed. See, the rules in the conflict changed because all of a sudden the roles in the conflict changed. And today we are starting a new series called Peacemakers that I'm so excited about because I think it's going to be so good for us to do a series like this where we look into what does it look like to deal with conflict and to make peace. To make peace out of it. And every conflict, just so you know, and note takers, you might want to start writing this one down, every conflict involves just two parts to it. Pretty much, they can boil it down to two parts. It's people and a problem. That's a conflict. It takes people and a problem. And it's so important that we realize that we need to address both because you can't, conflict can't be turned into peace by solving problems but running over people. You know, ignoring the fact that there's people involved too. And also, you can't honestly solve conflict and resolve conflict and turn it into peace when you just pander to people while ignoring the fact that there are real problems that need to be dealt with as well. And so today, as we start off the series with the message that I'm titling "You People," we are just dealing with the problem of people. Because on the other side of every conflict, every interpersonal conflict that you've ever had, every interpersonal conflict you're currently having, and every interpersonal conflict that you will have, there's always an other person or a group of other persons. And it could be as small as just you and me. That could be the group size right there. Or it could be even larger groups of people like me and people like them. Or it can be even to the scope of nations and world issues and all that. It can get bigger and bigger. But there's always other people. Those people. You people. Him or her or them. Always going to be those other people. And it could be that they're other because of their age or their skin tone or their language or their ethnicity or their gender or their different experiences that they've had or their different political leanings that they have or simply the fact that they have a different name than you. But except for one single person in this world, everyone else other than you is another. So there's all these other people. And at times, others really do, let's be honest, they get to us and we find ourselves having a good old conflict. And so whether that other is simply in a lane that you're trying to get into, or that other is in your marriage that you're in with them, and whether this ends up being a head-on collision where you're just dealing with it right on, or it's one of those conflicts that linger until suddenly a passive-aggressive comment gets made at Thanksgiving dinner. No matter what, I want you to hear something critical as we start this series called Peacemakers today. And so listen in, lean in as I inform you and tell you something we all need to realize. Too much of life involves conflict for you and I not to learn to succeed in this arena. It's just way too much of our life is either conflict or the possibility of conflict for us not to learn what it looks like to succeed in this area of life. And to get the most out of this series, I want to challenge you with something as we get started here. I want to ask you to do something. Would you just personalize it? As we go through today especially, but then the weeks to come, personalize this to your life and apply it wherever you can. You know, think of it in small ways like person-to-person skiffs that you might be having or that you've had in the past. And then also be thinking of like, where is this showing up in ideological battles? Like where you see the world differently than somebody else does, and it's a group of people. Find ways to apply this in different areas. And think of conflicts that, ones that you've had recently, or maybe ones that you're currently in, or conflicts that you plan on having this week, Think of it in the way of what is this going to look like for my life, and let God speak to you as we go through this series together. And that's the cool thing. Honestly, the beauty of the Bible is that God deals with tons of conflict of all shapes and all sizes and all kinds. And since this is such a huge part of the human experience, it kind of makes sense that God is going to have a lot to say about it. In fact, we'll start today by looking at Luke. Not Luke Skywalker, but Luke, the ancient Gentile doctor and historian. Because what he did is he went and found and listened to and heard the stories of Jesus and his ministry and then retold them in his gospel account called Luke. And so if you have your Bibles, you can go and get started looking there. But Luke is going to talk in this particular passage about it's a parable that Jesus said. So it's a made-up story, but it's dealing with a very real issue. So while Jesus makes up a story, it's a very real issue that we deal with, and it's an issue that hits closer to home than I think you or I would like to admit. But if you have your Bibles, let's go ahead and turn to Luke 18, and we're going to read verses 9 through 14. So Luke 18, verses 9 through 14, and it says, Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. So just to set this, he's talking to people that in themselves think they're pretty good and hold others in contempt. Here's a story. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, one of the most concerning parts of this parable, one of the most should be startling parts of this parable for us, is actually, I think, one of the parts that we would most likely have just drifted past without ever even thinking about it or realizing it, even though it was pretty much the central context of this story. And here it is. The dude was praying. Like the Pharisee was praying. And so what it shows us, as startling as it would be to maybe even realize this, is that we can even spiritualize our stigmas. We can baptize our biases. We can even pray our prejudices. Here's what's clear from Jesus' parable. It's that the Pharisee sees himself one way, but then he sees other people an entirely different way. You see, he sees himself far more graciously than he does that other person on the other side. But what maybe needs to be more clear for us as we look at this parable is that Jesus told this story so that you and I would see how easily we end up playing the Pharisee in our conflict situations ourselves. So I want us to do something today as we jump into this passage, we jump into the content of today's message. I want us to think of conflicts that hit close to home. Like I already said, let's think of some real life conflicts that you and I are going through or have gone through. Let's think of the Pharisee and the tax collector story. And then I also want to talk about two tough but critical realities about others that we're going to experience in our various conflicts that are going to help us to really learn from the Pharisee well. Are you ready? Here's the first one. They, whoever the others are, they're an image bearer. And by image bearer, I mean that they carry in themselves the very image of God. See, Genesis 1:27 says, in the creation story, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. In his image, God created mankind. So isn't it really cool? I mean, how cool is it that you are made in the image of God? Like, that is such a very cool thing for us to just sit in for a second and realize. But it doesn't say, just so we're clear, that God created man and woman in his image. And then after that, he created Karen. And then after that, he created the liberals. And then after that, he created that different race or whatever it is. It gives no indication either that there's room for speculation that there's varying degrees of the image of God in people. It's not like some people like you, obviously, are made a bit more in God's image. And then that person who cut you off on Route 3 when they knew that you were trying to switch lanes, they're obviously made a little bit less in the image of God. It's good for us to realize your dad was made in the image of God. Your crazy Aunt Trish was made in the image of God. Your ex was made in the image of God. Your professor was made in the image of God. Your coworker was made in the image of God. That wonderfully opinionated customer or client was made in the image of God. That second cousin who's constantly posting all those weird conspiracy theories on Facebook was made in the image of God. That neighbor who's the gun-toting redneck is made in the image of God. That barista who's the gun-grabbing social justice warrior was made in the image of God. Your boss was made in the image of God. Your governor was made in the image of God. And your president was made in the image of God. The Pharisee was made in the image of God. The tax collector was made in the image of God. When we forget the fact that people are made in the image of God, and let's be honest, we often do that pretty easily. What happens is then we don't see that conflict as people and problems anymore, those two elements, but instead of problems and problems with names or group identities. See, what happens is we dehumanize people, and then it makes it so much easier to just discard them. Just think of the ways that people talk about people when they're in a conflict situation. All the way from back when we were in elementary school and school bullies were, name calling, to how we gossip about people, to smear campaigns. The guy who wrote that article isn't a man who's made in the image of God. He's an absolute moron. Why would he think that? Your ex-wife isn't a woman made in the image of God. She's and I'll let you finish that one. That politician isn't an image bearer of God. And it ends up sounding like we're a lot like the Pharisee praying, doesn't it? I'm glad I'm not like other men. I'm glad I'm not like other women. I'm glad I'm not like other people. Glad I'm not as closed-minded as her. I'm glad I'm not as arrogant of a prick as him. I'm glad I'm not as self-absorbed know-it-all like her. I'm glad I'm not as entitled as them. I'm glad I'm not a bunch of morons like them. And I just want to ask you, are those them, those others, those hims, those hers, are they image bearers of the God who saw you in your weakness and loved you that you're talking about? Is that the same? They're image bearers of that God? Because here's my question. What would happen to the comments section, to the Facebook rants, to the news, and to our own personal conversations about people if the language of calling other people thugs, liberal snowflakes, conservative nut jobs, sheep, closed-minded bigots, immigrant trash, or idiots were all removed and instead exchanged and replaced with image bearers of God. They bear the image of God himself. This is how it should be for those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus. At the very least, we should talk about people differently. And that's not me saying that, because James himself, in chapter 3 of his book, says, with our tongue we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people, check this out, who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. So regardless of our skin, regardless of our ideologies, our history, our current behavior, our income levels, our sports team preferences, our accent, the ability to even speak, walk, or engage the world like with whatever we consider to be normal, every person from womb to tomb is a person made in the image of God. So here's the application point for this first realization that they're an image bearer. Here's what we do with this. Acknowledge that when you deal with others, particularly in conflict situations. Simply have this thought, have this realization. This person is someone that God made in his image, and that matters for something. Let's move on to point 2. The second thing we need to realize is this. Whoever the others are, they're more complex than you imagine. So, while I just got done saying we're all different and all that, but the reality is that because we're all people and we're all imperfect, we do have some unfortunate similarities. And one of them is this. Have you ever noticed that people tend to either assume too much about you, or they assume really unfairly things about you at times in moments? Like, isn't it awful that people, you got to get that from other people when you never do that to anyone else yourself? Okay, so obviously we do this sometimes ourselves to other people too. We see the temptation of conflict, and we're going to actually talk about a number of temptations in this series. This is just one of them, is that we want to oversimplify people. Like, we know them and we know who they are, therefore we know their motives and we know why they do it. And we don't even really think that we're doing this. It just happens. It's a tax collector. I know tax collectors. I've got you pegged. It's my husband. I know my husband. I've got nothing to learn. It's my child. I know my child. I'm the expert. I know what kind of person you are. You're the person who, fill in the blank. This expertise is why it's so likely that you and I will justify our actions while judging the actions of others, rather than judging our actions while justifying the actions of others. We'll let ourselves off the hook. We'll let ourselves kind of go off because we see the complexity of our life and all of its moving parts, and we see the complexity of our own decision making, and so we're more willing to give ourselves goodwill and understand, hey, it was a tough decision to make. But with others, whether they're an individual or they're a group, we end up drawing conclusions based off of our assumptions. We fill in the blanks. We want to do this. We've got to fill in the blanks, and so we do it as quickly as we possibly can, and so we do it ourselves. Think of it this way. It's like you're getting a test. Like, you're handed a test about a person, a particular person in the world. Maybe they're in the room. In fact, they are in the room, and yet as you go to take the test, you never once consult them to ask them any of the things about themselves. Now, do you want someone to make assumptions about the kind of person that you are, or why you did, or why you're doing something? Or would you rather they give you the courtesy of asking so that you can explain yourself? I know the answer, and I ask this question because of what Paul wrote in Philippians 2, 3, and 4, when he said, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." Now, also means that you can look to your own interest, but you need to look to others' interests as well. And both interests, as we just talked about, seem to be that we would like if people, chose to get to know us individually rather than just stereotyping or filling in the blanks for us, assuming it's not as complex or we're not as complex as we really are. And It's sad for me that this is what we do so easily, and we know that we do this because in a conversation that Madeline and I had with our wonderful elderly Argentinian neighbor the other day, we were talking about the neighborhood, and she kind of just said that there's one neighbor that hasn't really been friendly with her, and she wondered if it wasn't maybe because she's Latino. And it was so sad to hear her say that, going, well, maybe it's just because I'm Latino that they don't want to, get to know me. And I think we all hate when moments where we're on the receiving end of stereotyping or being oversimplified, because we kind of have this sense of like, well, I feel like if you got to know me, you'd probably kind of like me. I think you would. And it's why we have to catch ourselves whenever we hear blacks, white, Asians, Hispanics, millennials, boomers, liberals, conservatives, anti-vaxxers, welfare recipients, refugees, activists, pacifists, or any other kind of label that we may have. When we hear that label, perhaps some of the story of who they are, but we don't have much more. We got to realize there's so much more that we don't have. And even in close personal relationships where it's not just a person we meet on the street, we actually know this person. It is still so important for you and I to love people enough to realize we still don't have so much more of the info. It's this idea that when we decide that we have somebody all figured out, our ability to learn about them comes to a screeching halt. Like suddenly we have nothing more to learn because we have them all figured out. And so with those presuppositions that we have and those handful of observations that we've gathered from watching them, and then along with a mass amount of assumptions, we enter into the conflict with a person on the other side who's probably more a figment of our imagination than they really are the person who they really are. And that's why. Here's what we should do. I gave you an application for the first thought. I want to give you an application for what we can do with this idea that they're more complex than we often imagine they are. It's this: keep curious. I mean, it's that simple because curiosity helps us fight against stereotyping. The sense of, I wonder why you did that. I presume it's because of this, but I want to know. I want to know why. Why are you saying that? Why are you acting that way? Why are you thinking that way? Why? Because what happens is we can oftentimes want to make it black and white. Like you're on this side, and so if you're on this side, it's either got to be all my side or all your side. And we forget the fact that life is complex, that people are complex, and that there's a beauty in being open to listening, to hearing, and to learning about the other people instead of labeling them and writing them off. Because I'll tell you this, friend, it is so hard to love people when you're so busy labeling them. And it helps us to ask the important questions of other people, of ourselves, and of the situation, to be curious. And if you find yourself, let me just put this little side note in here. If you find yourself in a situation where you can't get to know the person better, or they really can't get to know you better, or it's unlikely, like let's say maybe online comment sections fit the bill for this, maybe you just excuse yourself altogether from the conflict. Because here's my question for you. Honestly, how likely is it that you're going to have healthy, God-honoring conflict in a moment where that person doesn't know you really, and you don't really know them? See, we've boiled this down to two realizations about others that are going to help you and I to bring peace to our conflict situations. So I want to just refresh our memory on these two simple things for today. One is that they're an image bearer. The person on the other side of this, you people, they're an image bearer of God. And the second thing is that they are, believe it or not, more complex than I imagine. They're more complex than I imagine. So, I thought two was pretty simple, but you know how I am. I like to distill it down to one thing, and here's my one thing that I want us to realize about conflicts today as we start this brand new Peacemakers series. It's this. You'll go further, and I'm talking about conflicts, but life really in general. You'll go further when you come to rather than come at. See, in conflict situations, it's a lot more tempting to just come at somebody, to just come at them and go after them. But when you come to the person, to recognize that they are a person made in the image of God, a person more complex and who probably has parts of who they are and why they think the way they think and do that are different than what you would imagine. I know it's shocking, but I think if we went this way, we went to them instead of at them, It's going to help us have Christ-honoring, God-glorifying peacemaking. See, as a child, like I said earlier, I was shocked when Luke Skywalker was found to be fighting an enemy much more complex than the one he thought he was just moments earlier. And I can also recall as a child being entertained by Dr. Seuss's book, Horton Hears a Who, when there was a shocking realization that an elephant was going to help these little creatures. And this whole book that Dr. Seuss wrote to teach a simple lesson that a person's a person no matter how small. But here's my question. While that's a simple reality, and it's great and it's true, why is it true? Like, why is it true that every person deserves to be treated as a person, no matter how small? Because there's lots of schools of thought out there, but none of them, aside from the view of Christianity, really offers a valuable answer for why we would treat people that way. In fact, one author I read this week said that might be actually the Bible's greatest contribution, Christianity's greatest contribution to this world. One of the greatest contributions would be our view of how we view and treat others. So, 2 Corinthians 5:20, Paul writes and has God saying that we are Christ's ambassadors, enlisted and empowered to invite others to be reconciled to God just as Jesus did, which probably means we should treat others the way Jesus treated others. We believe God made them in His image, so we have a view and a perspective and a lens by which we view people that makes it true that no matter who they are, we should see them as a person, and we should seek peace with them. See, the thing is, our carnal reaction to people that are different than us, if we're being honest, is usually comparison, judgment, and fear. But a Christ-like reaction is compassion, care, and concern. And which out of those combinations would you want people to do with you? Would you want them to compare themselves to you, judge you, and be afraid of you? Or would you rather they have compassion towards you, care for you, and concern? And I ask this because Luke 6:31 says, as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. So we end with this. We live in a contentious, divisive, and often, if we're being honest, peaceless society. And I wonder, though, do we ever honestly square away with what our life, our actions, and our commentary out there in the world maybe contribute to that peaceless society? The world's crazy. But do we ever stop and think about what our crazy might be adding to it? And do we ever maybe recognize that the others out there, maybe we should realize that there's some others out there that are seeing us as the others, that are really glad that we're listening to this message right now. And while we're thinking, man, I really hope that so-and-so, maybe I'll just send them this message, they're glad that you're watching it. Romans 12:18, Paul says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Which basically shows us it's not always guaranteed, because if it's possible, it means sometimes it's not possible. But he does says, as much as it depends on you. So we start the process of peacemaking by realizing that they matter. And we need to stop playing the Pharisee, stop spiritualizing our stereotypes and excusing away our biases, or not even realizing maybe that we have them, so never dealing with them and just going about our lives normally. And instead, we need to do the hard work of engaging people as image bearers and to work to make peace out of conflict, to work to go ahead and extend the grace that God has so freely given us so that we can be in right relationship with Him. We can start giving that grace to others and realizing that they are maybe as undeserving as we were in the first place when we got it. And then as we do this, we start to handle conflicts differently. We start to realize that there's peace that can come out of them. Because conflict is really, honestly, an inevitable part of life. But as we're going to find out, there's some ways to go ahead and make peace out of it. In fact, I'm really excited for next week, as I'm about to give you some really helpful tools and tips for how to win a fight. But as we end today, I just want to ask you this. Where are you in conflict right now? And how are you viewing the other people? What would it look like for us to view them differently? I want to invite you today, too. Maybe where you're at right now watching this, you've never made the decision to follow Jesus yourself. You maybe know about Him, but it doesn't mean you're actually living your life following Him and have had Him forgive you of your sins. But He wants to do that. And I want to encourage you, there's no reason to delay. If that's you today, pray and invite Jesus to forgive your sins. Invite Him to reconcile your heart to the heart of God, like we read about, or we talked about in 2 Corinthians 5:20. But then as you begin that journey, for those of you who are already following Jesus, I want to remind you, we are called to be peacemakers. So let's view other people in our conflict situations differently. And I'll see you next week for part 2.